I'm Terry Mayfield. We're talking about storytelling. Just make sure you're in the right room. I'm going to start with a story about a man who had just given a talk to a very large audience. Afterwards, another man came up to him and said, "Has anyone ever told you what a great speaker you are?" The man was all puffed up with pride. He's like, no one's ever told me what a great speaker I am. And the other man said, "Then why do you do it?" Now, as Toastmasters, hopefully that will never be said to you. Now, the reason I started with that was, it was a story, right? And it illustrates a point. What point did you get out of that story?
Humility.
Well, humility, you don't want to be humiliated. Maybe you got humility. But the idea is it illustrates something. And usually I use that when I'm talking to people about public speaking. And you don't want to go out and be humiliated, right, Roger? So its story sets out what you're going to talk about. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, is how powerful storytelling is in your presentations. It will gain better attention and will help you get your message across much more powerfully. Now, I'm going to start this session, so I'm going to start with another story that I use when I do sales training. And I'm going to stop, I'll stop at the end of the story and then I'm going to break it down. But I want you to pay attention to the points that you're getting out of my story. Welcome, come on in. Now, I have to take you back a little bit to set up this story. This goes way back in the beginning of my sales career. Now, my first career choice in life was not to be a salesman, it was to be a rock star. Now, obviously, I didn't make it, right? And I was forced to be a salesman, and I hated it, and I did very poorly at it for the first 3-4 years. All of a sudden, in fact, so poorly that my wife and I were broke. I'm very much in debt. But all of a sudden, things just broke loose, and things started, I was making money, and for the first time in our marriage, we had extra money. Enough to pay all our bills, and now we had something to spend on ourselves. And so my wife and I, Saturday morning, we sat down, and we were just giddy because we had this extra money for the first time in our marriage. And we thought, okay, what do we want to do with this extra money? Let's do something to reward ourselves. So my wife was sitting there at the coffee table, and she says, well, you know, I got to take you back. This is back in the early 80s. She goes, everyone in the neighborhood has a VCR. All our friends and relatives have VCRs. I want a VCR. Well, I told her, I don't think I want a VCR, but she told me I did. Right? So, now, way back when they first came out, this caused two problems for me. The first problem was I didn't know anything about VCRs. And have you ever had to go out and buy something that you didn't know anything about? I mean, you're afraid you're going to either spend too much or buy too little or not get the features that you want. So that was one of my fears. Now, the other fear I had, even though I was in sales, had been in sales for many years, I hate dealing with salespeople. I don't you? And I didn't want that slick, quick salesperson to give me nail into the wall and sell me something that wasn't the right machine for me or trick me to buying something too expensive. So to mitigate these two fears, I came up with a plan. Now, because I didn't know anything about the machines, what I did was I identified 5 stores, and I lived in the San Fernando Valley, 5 stores that I was going to go to and learn everything I could about the machines. Wasn't going to buy any, but just going to look and ask questions and learn about the machines. Then I was going to go home, digest all that information, and then the next day on Sunday go out and buy a machine. Now, to take care of my fear of being tricked by some slick salesperson, when I went out to those stores, I deliberately left at home my checkbook, my credit cards, and my wife. Now, that's not a derogatory statement because in negotiating, you know, if you've heard the term defer to higher authority, well, if I got, you know, some salesman got me pushed up and I said, I don't have a check behind me, he says, just sign here, and well, I can't buy this, I got to check with my wife. Well, I didn't check with my wife, but I left myself that out. Well, okay. So with this plan in mind, and this is a real story, I went out to the first store. Now, some of you who are a little closer to my age probably remember the Pacific Stereo. That was the first one I went to in North Hollywood. So I walked into the store, and they looked very much then like they do now. You walk into a Best Buy or something, you know, electronic store, and I started to look for the wall. You know what the wall is? You know, that's where they have that wall with all those VCRs. They have like shelf after shelf, maybe 30, 40 VCRs up there, all blinking 12 o'clock. And I walk in, I'm looking for the wall, and I see it. And I see all those machines, and I go, how am I ever going to decide which of those machines is the right one for me? And so I walk up there and I see the salesperson and I walk right up to him because I got a plan. I said, hey, I don't want to buy anything. I just want to know all there is to know about these machines. He said, great, what do you want to know? And I said, gee, I don't even know what I don't know. my plan fell apart. He says, well, do you mind if I ask you a few questions? I said, not at all. He says, do you have a camcorder now, or do you plan on getting one in the near future? Now again, this is back in the early 80s, and at that, my 8mm movie camera was just fine. No foresight on my part. He says, great, we don't need any of this section, and he moved me down the wall. He said, do you want high quality special effects? I said, gee, what are they, and why would I want them? He said, well, all of these in this section have multiple play and record hits, so that if you're watching something like, say, sporting events, you can, if you want to slow it down or get a freeze frame, you'll have a higher quality picture. I said, I couldn't care less about that. He says, great, move this on down the wall. Then he asked me, he says, what do you want the machine to do for you? I said, well, you know, I really just want to be able to record a show at my convenience and then watch it later. I mean, record it when I'm not home and then watch it later at my convenience. This was before rentals were even in. And he said, well, will you record more than 2 shows in a day? I said, I doubt it. He said, will you record more than 8 shows in a week? Never. He says, we don't need any of this section. And he moved me down to the last section. And then he asked, is there a particular brand that you prefer? I thought, well, you know, my sister has a Hitachi, hasn't any problems. I got a Hitachi stereo, that's a good brand. He says, great, I got 2 Hitachis right here. Now they looked identical, so I said, well, what's the difference? He said, well, one has a wireless remote, the other doesn't. And I said, well, what's the price difference? I figured one had to be more expensive. He says, well, the one with the wireless remote costs an extra $75. I said, you know, I'm not lazy. I'll get off my butt and change the channel to save 75 bucks. He said, here's the one you're looking for. Now, how many of you, if you were in my situation, would have bought that machine right there from that man? Anybody? Okay, some of you, right? But I had a plan. I also didn't have my checkbook or credit cards with me, so I thanked him very much, walked out of the store, got in my car, didn't go to those other 4 stores. I went home, got the checkbook, came back, and bought it. And the whole time, I never felt like I had been sold. He was just using another 4-letter word, help. He was helping me. And when he took me out to the car, he walked me out of the car with the machine, he was putting it in the backseat of my car. I said, you know, I'm in sales, and I really appreciate the way you sell. And he looked at me like he hadn't a clue what I was talking about. And I thought, that's how I want my customers to see me. That I'm not a salesperson, I'm just helping. Now, in my sales seminars, let me go a lot further and talk about more details, but let's just come up. What do you think are some of the points that were illustrated in that story? I mean, what did you get out of that story? What makes you a good salesperson?
A good listener.
Okay, yeah, he listened.
He asked the right question.
Okay, he asked questions.
He knew his merchandise.
And you know what? I'm not a bad writer and I'm not a good speller, excuse me. But he asked, would you say good questions? Right questions.
He asked the right question.
Yeah, and that's important too, the right question. You just ask me, you know, what time it is. What else did somebody say?
He knew his merchandise.
Right, he knew his product.
Oh, that one definitely.
What else? Anything else you get out of that? Okay, well the important thing is, then we go through, and aren't these like bullet points for me to train myself?
He was patient, that's one thing.
He was patient, okay. Now, I could have easily, and I knew all these things, and there's several other steps we could get out of that. I could just stand there, have these bullet points, go to my salespeople and say, okay, you gotta listen better, and talk about listening skills. You gotta ask the right questions, and what are the right questions? You gotta be, you know the product, and you gotta be patient. But do you think, when they heard that story, they had a better understanding of what all these points were? That's why we use stories in our communication. Now, I've gone to a lot of these sessions before, and I hear people very knowledgeable. They give us all the bullet points, they tell us everything we need to know, we write it all down, and by the end of the session, I'm sitting there, I am so bored related. Because people want you to relate the stories with the bullet points to real life. And you can do that in any of your talks. And if you're missing stories in your talks, you've got to incorporate stories. And that's what we're talking about today. Anyone seen the movie Lincoln recently?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Great movie. I love it. I think it was a much better portrayal of what the real Lincoln was. And do you remember what Lincoln did quite often? People would come ask him something, and what did Lincoln do? No. He told a story. And he knew, and one of the greatest leaders ever, he knew that to get the message across, it was better to use a story than to lecture. So if you haven't seen Lincoln, when you do see it, or when you see it again, just notice how he used stories to get his point across. And sometimes the people, we don't want a story. That was their reaction. But it was so illustrative of what the point was. Now, what I'd like to do to make this interactive, I'm going to give you a heads up now, right at the last 5 minutes, gosh, we lost about 15 minutes of today, is if any of you have a short story, like maybe less than 2 or 3 minutes, that you'd be willing to come up and share with us, and let us tear it apart, help you with it. But be constructive about it, and maybe either find out what good points you had about the story, what made it a good story, or maybe offer you some assistance in making it a better story. So be thinking about it. If you would like to volunteer, we'll only have time for one, unfortunately. And just a short story that you've used before or given before, okay? And if the story gets a little too long, it may cut you off just because we only have so much time. So it's not important that you finish the story, but we at least hear a piece of it and how to improve it. So I talked about the VCR salesman again. Just that story sets it up so much. So why use stories? First of all, it keeps people's attention. When I was telling that story, when someone tells you a story, what do you wait for? The end, right? You're anticipating the end, and when you want to wait for the end, don't you pay more attention? You're more focused on it. Now, I apologize for using so much notes. If this was a program I gave over and over, I wouldn't have any notes, but this is one I put together specifically for you guys, so I need to refer to my notes a lot. People want to know how it resolves. That's how you gain their attention. You're not going to gain much attention when you start listing off a bunch of facts. But when you tell them a story, you've got that rapt attention. And you'll get better retention of your ideas. And you have to ask yourself, what's the message that you want to get across? Now, I opened up with that story about the speaker who wasn't a good speaker. That's a great setup. The point I want to get across with that one is that maybe you need to hone your skills to be a better speaker, and how do you do it? And I use that when I'm trying to recruit people to Toastmasters. The idea of the salesman's story, of course, was to illustrate a good salesperson and how they do it. So you're just trying to get across your points through the story. And for me, the thing I get the most out of public speaking is I'm not one that likes to be up here and hear the applause. In fact, I get a little embarrassed by all that and the accolades and stuff. What I appreciate is when I'm talking to a group like this, and I see somebody and their eyes just go, and that light bulb goes on, and you know they got it. So that aha moment. And to me, that's what I like. And when you're telling a story, you get that aha moment. Because when I was telling that story about the VCR, and I got to the point that I went back and bought it, I could see somebody just going, yeah, that's how you do it. That to me is the payoff. So, what makes a good story? And I've got 5 points for you here. The first one is to make a story good, you should tell it as if it's happening now. Make it live. Now, did you get that feeling that I was talking when I'm doing that VCR story, that it was obviously it was something that happened in the past, but didn't I bring you with me back to that moment? Or I brought that moment back here. You want to talk about it live. I hear a lot of people use stories like this and say, well, I walked in the store, then I did this, then he told me this, then that happened, then that happened. No, just tell it as it's happening. Make it live. And the real art of communication is taking that videotape of what's happening in your mind, translate it into words so that they get the same interpretation and put the same picture in their mind. So you're really just talking about a sequence of events that's happening live. The second thing is to add action, because they need to see it. Couldn't you see me walking down, you saw me walking in the store, you could see the wall, you could see the VCR man or salesperson pushing me down the wall. When you pointed to that one, that's where your action, that's where a lot of your gestures will come from. Add action to it, make sure it's live. The third step is don't present what happened, present what is happening. Again, that's going kind of back to making sure that it's live. And then 4, leave out extraneous information. I'll give you an example of that and then I'll come back to that. And then 5 is the punchline. Now we usually think of punchline when there's a joke, but the punchline is just that point, that often comes from. Let me give you an example of another story I use in a lot of my talks when I'm talking about time management. I don't know, Stephen Covey's 7 Habits, his habit called Sharpen the Saw. Now I can give all a bunch of bullet points of why you need to sharpen your saw, but I use this story to illustrate it first to set it up. Now imagine that we're standing in front of the forest, and there's a trail right here. You see two loggers enter the forest at the exact same time. They're both the same size, shape, age, experience, ability, both carrying the same type of axe, and then one goes this way in the forest and the other goes that way. And they start chopping wood, and they chop all day long. And then at the end of the day, they meet right back at that same path, and the one logger says, hey, he says, we're the same size, shape, age, experience, ability, and we work the same number of hours, we use the same type of axe, but I noticed that my pile of wood is this big, and your pile of wood is this big. How can that possibly be? And I noticed several times throughout the day, you stopped and took a break and sat under that tree. I never stopped once. Even at lunch, I was eating with one hand and chopping wood with the other. And don't you know people who work like that, right? You may be one of those. He says, again, why is my pile of wood this big and your pile this big? Well, the other logger says, well, it's true, we're the same size, shape, age, experience, ability. Both carrying the same type of axe, and we work the same number of hours. And yes, you saw me several times sitting under that tree taking a break, but you were so busy chopping wood that you didn't notice that sometimes while I was under that tree, I was sharpening my axe. That's how we increase our productivity, by taking time to sharpen our axe. Now, with the rest of that story, I go on to illustrate that point even more with specifics. But isn't that story more powerful than just listing a bunch of bullet points? Now, going back to that story and breaking it down a little bit, I said earlier, leave out extraneous information. I hear a lot of people try to use stories, and that's what blows me. Now, you saw that there was a forest. I didn't say, oh, it was the middle of the day, the sun was shining, the birds were singing in the forest, there was a lot of aspen, there was some Douglas fir, and it was really dense. Did that have anything to do with the story? No, forest. So you want to cut out all the extraneous stuff. And then talk about the punchline, to illustrate a punchline. I could have said, when the one logger said, well, yes, I was sitting on that tree and I was sharpening my axe and I take a break and I do a lot of things. He said, you didn't notice that. That's why I was sitting under that tree. As opposed to, what did I say? The last words I said was, sometimes I was sharpening my axe. That was the punchline. And I saw a lot of you going like this, right? So that's an illustration of how you want to structure your stories. Now, here's how I do it. Whenever I do a 5 to 7 minute talk, I get on my computer and I type it out just as if I'm talking. And I know how many words, it's like about 500-600 words, so I can tell if I'm too long or too short. But then I go through it and I start chopping those extraneous sentences and descriptions. Does this really add value to the story? Now, I'm not saying to write it down to memorize it, but at the same time, you've got to streamline it, whatever works for you. You might record your story and listen to it back again and say, okay, did that add to the story? Because if it doesn't add, what does it do? It's taken away. So I want to give somebody an opportunity right now. Does anybody here have a story that they would like to share in front of the group? Great, come on up. What's that? Again, I may cut you off. Go ahead and introduce yourself, and I'm only 2 or 3 minutes, but I may cut you off. No offense.
Sure. Hi, my name is Alethea Coleman. I was your fall contest chair. I will be your spring conference chair, and I look forward to seeing you guys on. This is actually my friend's story, and I've given it a couple times a speech. It's called Open Arms. My friend and her husband have been married for many, many years. She could not have any children, and they both really wanted kids. So they decided to do the next best thing, adopt a child. They filled out the paperwork, they sent it in. They waited for 1 whole year before they finally got the phone call. We found the perfect match for you. We found your child. She and her husband jumped on a plane from California, and they traveled halfway around the world to Siberia, Russia. Now, this young boy was actually an infant, living in an orphanage, and he laid there still, as if he were dead, inside this crib. People came to and from this orphanage on a daily basis, adopting children of all different ages. He still lied there, Nobody paid attention to him, and he didn't move at all. He wasn't being adopted. Finally, my friends walked into that orphanage. They opened the door and took one step, and as soon as she stepped in, that little boy stood up in the crib and reached his arms out. He had found his mom and his dad, and she reached her arms out and picked him up. Now it took about another month for them to go through the court system in Russia, but they finally brought little Matthew home. Today he is 8 years old, living with his mom out in Santa Clarita. She's a single mom because her husband had passed away about 5 years ago of a sudden heart attack when they were out shopping. But he's just a strong boy and a strong bond between mother and son. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Good story to share. It's a motivational story. Excellent. Let's get some feedback from you. What did you hear? Anything that she said that she could have said differently, or anything positive you liked about her story? Yes.
I don't want to be negative, I know we got a short time.
This is constructive.
But
It's not negative.
Number one, it was a compelling story.
Yes. Yes.
Very interesting. If we listen to what you had said earlier, just to hit those, the story was interesting, but it was not her story.
Right.
But it still was a very interesting story. When you talked about it in past tense. They went out and did this. And then, thirdly, a little bit more action. You tended to stay in one spot, but there was this one point where they walked through the door. You did step forward, and you need to use that a little bit more throughout the story.
Good. Thank you. Something else. Okay, be more live. Yes.
A number of the points that you've already made would be the same observations that I had. However, I would say that what was missing, because it was a very compelling story, was the punchline at the end. It felt like it was there, but we passed over it. We went on to tell more story, and there was a time we could have just closed it right up and been right there.
Now, if I could be so bold as to maybe reconstruct that story a little bit
Sure.
and see what you think. Now, I think there was two stories that came into one. There was your friends who couldn't have a baby. That was one story. And then the other story was this young boy in Russia who was not being adopted for whatever reason.
Right.
What were your friends' names?
Brian and Debbie.
Brian and Debbie. That's another way to make stories more real is use Brian and Debbie rather than you say my friends Brian and Debbie, and then that brings it into Brian did this and Debbie did that. So I have two friends, Brian and Debbie, and go through their secrets. They've been married many years, but at one point in their life they found they couldn't have a baby. Then they went through the process of adopting, they filled out the paperwork, and then one day they get the phone call. I've been saying they got the phone, so I'm saying make it live.
Yeah.
Brian picked up the phone and says, "We've got some for you in Russia." So it's more live. Does that make sense? Does that sound? And then the other story, you can almost stop there abruptly, and you go, now, over in Russia, picture this. Here's an orphanage. Dozens of babies, I don't know how the numbers are, or to describe it, maybe Brian and Debbie can fill it out for you a little more. But all these babies, and people come in and adopt these kids all the time, but back there in the corner is one little boy who lies listless. No one has come to adopt him. And they didn't think they would ever adopt him. In come Brian and Debbie. The second they walked in the room, that little boy stood up because he saw his mom. Okay, see, it's more live.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Does that sound like a good, good way to go with the story?
Yes.
So, and then you can, and so there's your punchline. Doesn't mean that's the end of the story.
Right.
And then you can, fast forward 8 years later, picture it and give it through a description. So you've got a compelling story, and just by bringing it live and just rearranging some of the events a little bit more logical. Got it.
Thank you.
And you're a great speaker. Thank you. Did that make sense? Anybody else have a story they'd like to share?
Actually, I have a question, Terry.
Yes, sir.
You know, when you spoke about your story and you said it has to be in the present, so basically are you saying you can't use past tense at all when you're writing your story? So everything has to be in the present tense?
Gosh, I think as you describe it, you can be going back and forth, but when you're telling the story, make it sound like we're there. So that as you're telling it, it sounds like it's happening right now. It could be something in the past when I was doing that VCR, obviously that was in the past, it was like 30-some years ago. but the idea, but it seemed like, but you were real with me right there. That explains it. It's not that you can't use the past tense. Yes?
I'm sorry.
Great.
My name is Paula Whidden, and if you can imagine me when I was younger, I used to walk to school every day. So I'm walking to school every single day. As I walk to school, I go around the corner, and the house almost right behind our house had this thing that was very trendy for businesses at the time. You know those scroll down windows that kind of lock everybody out? This house had those scroll down full metal windows in front of every window in the house and the front door. Every single day I walked past this house. And at first it was just, oh, why do they have that? Then I discovered myself thinking, oh, that's sad. And then I found myself thinking, oh, I never want to be like that. And I've discovered that because I walk past that house every day, 4 years out of my life, when somebody asks me, what am I most afraid of? Immediately I picture that house. What am I most afraid of? Being afraid.
Thank you. Any insights on yours? To share? Yes.
I mean, I liked her story, but I liked her story better because it was her. And for me, I think it's people explain things or they tell something when it's related to them directly. There's no poking or prying. You really have to know what it is. The beginning of it, I think it could have been like a better start, but you know.
And in what way can you give us a?
I should have wrote it down.
Okay.
But it was like, so there we are, and you know, like, that's what I thought. That it was just all of a sudden, oh, you know, when I was 8, and she could have been like, oh, when I was a kid, I lived here, and like, you know, my house was here, and it was like a nice place, like a little bit more descriptive. But then there was a house around the corner, because where I lived, there was a house around the corner that was scary, and I was just like, when I would pass by, I don't know, go away from that. But it was just like I felt like I was like just thrown into it.
Okay.
And then it's like, oh,
Good. Yes.
I want to know if you were ever able to see in the window, like what made you afraid? Like you never got to see inside.
I never saw through the window, and I forgot to share, after I graduated college years later, I discovered that lady who lived there, apparently was a lady I never knew, lived there, and when they found her dead, she only had a mattress on the floor of her whole house. And it was like, I don't live down there.
See, she had the furniture.
Yeah.
Yes, one more.
I was, if you open it with a question, have you ever met people, or do you know anybody that shuts himself off from the rest of the world, or something like that? Or so would almost kind of like give your reason for saying it, for telling the story. Because we all know people like that just say they don't want to deal with the world.
You know, and that's a good way to start with a question to kind of set it up. And yours was about fear. And again, trying to get the audience on your side here, right? You certainly, you know, have you ever been afraid of anything? There was something that scared me to death when I was a little girl. And then, as you were pointing out, go into the story. You were describing the neighborhood, the street behind. I'm like, okay, we didn't. None of that mattered. Didn't care. But to say, when I was a little girl, I don't know how old you were, 7 or 8, 8, whatever it was, and I'd be walking to school. As I got around the corner, I'm walking around the corner and I see this house. I saw this house. I see this house, and all the windows have armor on them. You described it better. The scroll down. You see the scroll down. That was on every single window, even on the door. And then go back to being there. What did that make you think? Whatever. I wondered what was in there. Why did they have to do that? My thought when she was telling the story, I'm thinking, man, I don't want to be in that house if it's on fire. How do you get out? That's what I would have been afraid of. And then towards the end of the story, you told us, you said, and I was thinking, and you told us what you were thinking, rather than say, And what I thought was
yeah.
this, so
Okay.
that's the difference of bringing us into the
It's so
moment.
funny, because I thought I was in the present, I'm thinking about it, but I didn't do it.
You're seeing it, well, that's it, and so the thing to do is either write it out, or like I said, or do an audio of it and listen to it, and see how you can, just those subtle little words, but that one thing where you said, and I was thinking, don't tell us what you're thinking, reveal to us what you're thinking. And I looked at that house and I thought, any other comments? Yes, Bill?
Paul, I thought you could elaborate a little more about what you were fearful of, the unknown, might be something scary inside. Also, I thought the natural takeoff for kind of a metaphor of things that we keep inside, things that we keep outside. And you might be able to play with that.
Okay, well, thank you so much for stepping up. Okay, open up to any questions or comments about storytelling? Yes?
Well, regarding the story that you just gave, I liked how you took one word and made it seem like she was telling the story now. When you said, "I see this house and I saw this house," goes back to her question: how do you make the question? How you make your story seem like it's in the present? And I just wrote down that just one word can change the way that story is presented.
And that's the thing, that's a subtle difference in storytelling. Now, really my background in storytelling is my father knows every joke that ever existed in the world. And he's a great joke teller, and he's known for that. So I've heard every stinking joke there is. He used to, I'm not kidding, at 5 o'clock in the morning, because he'd read them in books, he came in one morning, woke me up and said, here's a joke. And he'd read it, I'm supposed to laugh? And he wouldn't leave until I laughed. Here's a little story, but so I learned from my father how to tell stories and the power. Have you heard people tell bad jokes? Mm-hmm. Because they say too many words to say it, they don't get concise in what they're saying, and they use the exact word. I got to think of when it was that happened where you could screw it up. What was the situation? A friend of mine ordered Larry. Oh, I know what it was. I walked in and I told him, I says, just a quick riddle. I said, what do you get when you cross the Atlantic with the Titanic?
What?
Halfway. Now, but here's what happened. Somebody 2 minutes later walks in the room and Larry goes, hey, I got a joke. What do you get when you mix the Atlantic and Titanic? And the guy goes, what are you talking about? See, mix and cross. Those words are so, we can cross wires, we can mix wires, right? They're interchangeable. But in that context, it had to be that exact word or it confuses somebody. So you're right, one single word can confuse your audience or it can just enlighten them. Yes?
You said in present tense as opposed to past tense, so you alluded to this also, but when you first say what you're saying, many years ago when I was a boy, and then, in other words, you give the audience what tense you're in, and then you talk in the present tense.
Yes. Yeah, you can set it up. You say, when I was a boy, I'd walk down the street, and it was all dust all over the place, and my shoes would be getting dirty. You can describe it in that way. And I came up, and there was a big tree, and I would look at that tree, and I would think, oh gosh, I want to climb that tree. Telling a story as opposed to, when I was little, I used to walk down the street, it was really dirty and stuff, and I'd see a tree, and I wanted, I think the ED word, or ED on the end of the word, rather than I'd look at the tree and say, I want to try this, I'd say, I want it. That's making it more the past versus the present. Does that make sense? But yeah, you got to kind of set up at some point. I set it up that my talk on the VCR stuff, and that's back in the 1980s. I set up the time frame, but then we all went back there to that time. Yes?
In her story, I thought it was a good story, but I suppose if you really thought about it and analyzed it, there was more things that made it scary. Maybe she was walking down the street, and when the wind blew, the things would kind of make a crickly noise, or if there was lightning, it would reflect off of that metal and make it all the brighter. There's probably other elements that would not add a lot to, that would not take a lot of time, but that would really punch why it was frightening.
And I'm going to go, exactly, the more descriptive you can be, and I think if she goes back and rewrites that story, she can add those elements. And someone mentioned about, the stories that are yours are more powerful than if they're someone else's. That's true. I think the best stories are your stories. The second best, just a little bit below it, is someone else's story. I mean, I used the story of the loggers. That wasn't my story, but it still illustrated the point. But the most powerful stories are going to be your stories. But there's even one point, there's a story, I'll give you 1 more minute here. There was a story that I was using that was about me, but it was a little bit too much, look how great I am. And my coach told me, he says, it doesn't matter that it's you. You're trying to illustrate a point. You're not trying to look good. So I started telling that story in the third party. Rather than saying, I sat down one day and I was reading the Reader's Digest and I saw this article about this woman, and I did this. I said, a man. Read an article in the magazine, and then I went through the whole story about this other man. Nobody had a clue it was me. And it was much more powerful. The point got across. I was getting in the way of it. Now, the other thing you may have heard other speakers do is at the end of that story, you can allude to, actually, that was about me. Now they can go back and say, oh, aha. But you can take your story and make it even more powerful by making it a third-party story, too, sometimes. If you're not, as long as you're not getting in the way of the story. One last question. Anybody? Okay. Did everybody do the sign-up sheet? If you haven't, please do. If you got an evaluation, just fill them out and drop them off on the table. Thank you so much for attending this session. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.